lists. So it was about a year ago, and many of you were witnessing and taking part in that when the EU decided to step out of the Energy Charter Treaty. And before that, in the months before, lots of EU member states have done the same already. One by one, we saw countries stepping out of it. And a year ago, we also celebrated this already because I think this ECT campaign was very strongly driven by civil society, and a lot of the organizations here were very active at national and Brussels level. So we can clearly take that to our credit that we succeeded in that. But we also soon realized that we are far from done with that because this ISDS mechanism, which was one of the two reasons for the EU and member states to step out of the ECT, this ISDS mechanism, which was not in line with EU law, we found out, or we knew that already, but in more than 1,000 bilateral investment treaties of EU member states, this mechanism is still included. So we still have a big problem there. And we see that increasingly these bilateral investment treaties between EU member states and other countries are used to file cases against EU member states, but also European companies filing cases against third countries. And even sometimes we see companies or investors from outside the EU which are using member state bilaterals with other countries outside the EU, for instance, Ukraine, to start cases against these countries. So there's a big problem there. What we also found out that with the debate on the ECT was very much driven by the argumentation that the ECT and ISDS is undermining environmental and especially climate policies of the EU and its member states. But we also found out that actually the cases that we were looking into and which were presented a week ago, we presented 10 new cases of ISDS involving EU member states or involving European companies. We found out that also in critical other EU policy areas, companies are challenging EU policies and member states. And these include cases on sanction policies, on national security policies, on tax policies, and many others. And some of these cases will be highlighted here today. So we continue to see that ISDS is problematic. It's an undemocratic system, and it allows investors and companies to basically get what they want and to put the bill of the costs that they, or the damage that they are causing on society, because it's the taxpayers who in the end have to pay for these claims that they are getting. So that's why we are saying that we will be bringing arguments and evidence today by different speakers that this ISDS mechanism, which is in the bilaterals, is also in violation. It's not only undemocratic and unethical, but it's also violating EU laws, which is an important argument. So today is also the start of a campaign of lots of the groups here in the room, a campaign to start getting ISDS out of the bilaterals of EU member states. And that's going to be a big task because I mentioned already there's more than 1,000 of them. We're not going to have to do them one by one. We expect that if some of these, if we're successful in getting them out of some of those, we will get a multiplier effect, because we will also starting a call on the European Commission to start infringement procedures against EU member states that do not address the issue that these ISDS mechanisms in their bilaterals are illegal. So once the Commission takes up this role of supervising that the bilaterals are in line with EU law, then we expect that if we're successful there on a couple of cases, that the Commission will also have to do that for all these other 1,000 treaties. So that's where I stop for the moment, and I hand over to Lynn for a further introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming along today. And I think at the moment, for anybody who's working in the space of trade or climate or even human rights for that matter, it's a pretty grim picture we have. So it's always good to get back into the room and be thinking about how we can campaign and to, I suppose, positively put all of the energy that we have as a force for good. And I think that the Energy Charter Treaty is one of those where we can look at how a campaign can be won and how it can be successfully won. And I think it teaches us those valuable lessons. And first is that the role of civil society is crucial in campaigning. There's no country would have taken the step to withdraw if it wasn't for the tireless research, the campaigns, the actions organised by civil society organisations across Europe. They informed the public, they mobilised the political support, and they made sure that the Energy Charter Treaty became a political issue. And it is one, as we heard, it is seen as sometimes as a geeky topic, but it was through organisations like yourself that made it relevant to people's lives, and that's what we have to do with ISDS in general. I was doing my master's on the Energy Charter Treaty, and it was interesting to see how in the space of a year it became from something that no journalist knew to journalists actually coming to you and saying what's going on at the European level. So I think we do need to give ourselves, a pat on the back for that, and also just to recognise that we got valuable lessons from it. I think the second lesson was targeting the European Parliament really paid off. We know that this House was instrumental in shaping the outcome that we are celebrating. We changed the EU climate law to say that investment agreements like the ECT should not protect fossil fuel investors. And also the Parliament stood firm with the so-called modernised ECT was still incompatible with the EU climate commitments. In October 2020, that crucial paragraph was inserted into the climate law that stated the Union shall end protection of investment in fossil fuels in the context of the Energy Charter Treaty. And it was that decision that then set the path for the EU's exit almost four years later. So as I said, it is a victory. It is one that we need to hold on to. As Rebecca Solnit says, we need to bank the victories for millions of EU citizens, for social movements and for climate action. And it will be used to minimise the risk of EU governments being sued for phasing out fossil fuels. But getting out of the ECT, and I don't need to tell people in this room, is definitely not enough. There are still, as we've heard, thousands of international investment treaties in force worldwide. There are EU member states are party to around 1,500 of those, and these treaties still protect the fossil fuel investments and still contain the same ISDS mechanisms that we have just rejected with the ECT. So they do give fossil fuel investors the right to sue governments for doing what is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I suppose today's event is, what are we going to do about all of those old treaties? We can't unpick them one by one, I agree. I think we have to build a campaign to force countries to withdraw from them. And we need to ask, why is the Commission still including fossil fuel investment protection in new trade negotiations? As if we celebrate the exit from the ECT but continue to protect the fossil fuel investors in bilateral investment treaties, then the EU is guilty of hypocrisy. We are saying that only our governments, our own governments cannot be sued for climate policies, but we're absolutely fine and comfortable if European fossil fuel companies can sue third countries for taking climate action. So we need to get this Parliament onto the page of calling for coherence. We cannot celebrate the EU's ECT exit while maintaining the system that allows European corporations undermine the climate action in the global south. And that's why today's debate is so important. There's people who are far more expert in this topic. Today will present clear, concrete next steps to address the incoherence and ones that will help us stop protecting fossil fuel investors once and for all. So I look forward to the conversation. I can give you the assurances that the left group will continue to fight for the abolition of ISDS in all its forms, including in CETA, that ICS, watered down version. But we must be consistent in climate justice, and I hope we have a fruitful conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. We're going to have two panels today. The first panel will focus a bit more on the impacts and the risks of ISDS, and the second panel will look more into the way forward. So I'm happy to present the first speaker, which is Bart-Jaap Verbeek from SOMO. And he will talk a little bit about ISDS developments and also a short introduction into one of the upcoming or already existing cases that Exxon has started against the Dutch government.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Many thanks to the organizers of this debate. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yes, I prepared some slides. I see they're up. Great. So I'd like to start by going back in time a little bit, because this month, it's exactly 10 years ago that Cecilia Malmström, who was then the EU Trade Commissioner, called ISDS the most toxic acronym in Europe. And at that time, Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, it really had become a lightning rod for public outrage, really across Europe. Because citizens realized what was at stake here. So the extraordinary power granted to corporations to challenge democratic decisions through private tribunals. So we can ask ourselves the question, what has happened since that moment, since 2015? Because on the surface, a lot has changed. There has been lots of debates around ISDS. The European Commission has responded to the critique by developing and proposing new forms of investment protection, such as the investment court system and the idea of a multilateral investment court. And these were presented as solutions, right? So they introduced standing judges, more transparency in the proceedings, and the possibility of appeal. But really at the core, the problem still remains, because these new models still allow foreign investors to bypass domestic legal systems. They still create privileges for corporations that ordinary citizens and trade unions or communities do not enjoy. And they still risk having a chilling effect on policymaking and discouraging governments from enacting ambitious regulations out of fear of costly lawsuits. So the greatest challenge actually lies not in these new, can you go back to the previous slide, please? Yes. So the main challenge is not the new treaties, it's the existing treaties. There are thousands of treaties still in place, as we just heard. And despite a decade of debate, the number of ISDS cases is still growing. So at the end of 2024, according to statistics from UNCTAD, there were more than 1,400 known treaty-based ISDS cases worldwide. And 3/4 of them were brought between 2010 and 2024. So this really shows that this is not a fading system of the past, but it's really a growing feature of global governance still today. Next slide, please. And European states are very much in the fire line here. So again, according to UNCTAD, a total of 316 cases have already been brought against EU member states, but also against the EU as a whole. Central and Eastern European states have been hit the hardest, but also Western European states are not immune to this system. So Germany has already faced 7 cases, the Netherlands and Belgium 4 cases each, France 3, Denmark 2, and Spain tops the list with an astonishing 58 cases already. And in fact, except for Ireland, every single EU member state, including the EU itself, has been targeted at least once. And the legal basis of these claims is very well known. Nearly 2/3 of these cases come from our bilateral investment treaties. Another 123 cases have been brought under the Energy Charter Treaty. And the trend is really moving in the wrong direction. So between 1994 and 2014, there were 144 cases. But in the past 10 years alone, there have been 172. And strikingly, the vast majority are intra-EU disputes brought by European investors against other European states. Next slide, please. When we look at the sectors that are being targeted by ISDS claims in Europe, you could argue that they reflect the most pressing issues of our time. There have been 113 cases related to energy supply alone in Europe, 48 cases in financial and insurance services, 40 in manufacturing, and 21 in mining and extractive industries. Next slide, please. So energy cases are especially relevant for the debate on climate action, as we just heard. So around 1 in 5 ISDS cases worldwide relates to fossil fuels. And some of the most high-profile cases that we see today directly challenge some of the climate measures that states are taking. So, for example, both Germany and the Netherlands have faced claims by foreign investors over their respective coal phase-outs. But also on the other side of the energy transition, renewable energy has also been caught in ISDS litigation. So countries such as Spain and Italy, but also Bulgaria, Romania, other EU member states, they introduced incentives to attract investment in solar and wind power, only to later adjust those schemes. And as a result, investors have brought dozens of ISDS cases demanding compensation, regardless of shifting economic or policy realities. But whether fossil fuels or renewables, ISDS makes it more costly for governments to adjust their regulatory frameworks. Investors demand stability and locked-in returns, but governments need the flexibility to respond to climate science, to social needs, and to democratic debate. Next slide, please. And while European states are increasingly being sued, European investors themselves are also among the most active users of ISDS abroad, as we also just heard. Since 2015, so since Cecilia Malmström made that statement, EU-based companies have launched 193 new cases against countries outside the EU. And that's almost as many as in the 2 decades before that. So also here there is a growing trend. And the most frequent claimants come from the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy. Next slide, please. And the financial stakes of all these ISDS cases are enormous. So again, research by UNCTAD shows that between 2000 and 2009, the average award ordered by tribunals was about $68 million. But we see that in the past decade, that average has risen to over $250 million. And a key reason is that most of these ISDS claims are based on old generation investment treaties that provide little or no guidance on damages and how to calculate compensation. So what we see in practice is that tribunals have often wide discretionary power to decide which kind of valuation technique to use in these arbitration cases. And what we see is that they increasingly use valuation techniques like discounted cash flow models, which is based on the projection of decades of hypothetical profits into the future. So not only that companies need to be compensated for just what they actually invested, but also what they could have expected in the future in terms of profits. And the results are really staggering. So roughly 1 in 20 cases now results in an award larger than $1 billion. We've seen a case against Pakistan by a mining company where the tribunal awarded more than $4 billion for a mine that never became operational. We see also a case against Italy by a British investor called Rockhopper that was awarded nearly 200 million euro for an oil project that also never received all the necessary operating permits. And meanwhile, the size of the investor claims have also exploded. So in the last decade, the average claim stood at $1.1 billion. That's nearly triple the level of earlier periods. And some of these claims really go beyond belief. So there is a set of disputes by a mining investor suing Australia for nearly or over $200 billion over an iron ore and coal mines and a coal-fired power plant. It's $200 billion. It's really out of proportion. And no domestic court would accept such speculative claims for profits that never materialized, nor would most other international courts and tribunals. Again, this is research by UNCTAD. But under ISDS, these types of claims and awards are becoming the norm. And the result of that is that you get very unpredictable, inflated awards that really can destabilize public budget and public finances. And this is particularly problematic for countries in the global south. So a single award can really wipe out entire health or education budgets. But also for European states, it diverts taxpayer money away from urgent public needs. Next slide, please. And as we also heard before, around the world, governments are really waking up to the risks of ISDS and reassessing their investment treaties. And some countries have even taken the bold step to terminate most or all of them. And in Europe, as we also heard, the withdrawal from the Energy Charter Treaty was really a historic milestone in that sense. Because it's the first time that a group of advanced economies openly acknowledge that ISDS is incompatible with climate policy and therefore the only logical conclusion was to withdraw from a treaty that allows that. But still, let's be clear, even after the ECT exit, Europe still remains entangled in more than 1,000 bilateral investment treaties that expose states to the same legal risks. So unless these treaties are also addressed, the toxic legacy of ISDS will remain. And this matters more than ever. We are living through overlapping crises. We have climate breakdown. We have a turbulent energy transition, rising inequality, geopolitical insecurity, growing distrust in public institutions. And across all of these arenas, we see that corporations are not only lobbying to shape the rules in their favor, they are also weaponizing ISDS against governments that act in the public interest. And then, as a bridge to the next speaker, I mean, take ExxonMobil as an example here. On the one hand, it is fiercely lobbying against the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It was all over the news in the past days, which is a very important piece of legislation that is meant to hold corporations accountable for the human rights abuses and the environmental harm that they're causing. And at the same time, ExxonMobil is suing the Netherlands under ISDS. And the case here concerns the Groningen gas field. We will hear more about it in a second, which was once Europe's largest gas field. And decades of extraction has caused earthquakes that destroyed the homes and communities and of the people living in the area. And after years of pressure, the Dutch government finally decided to phase out gas production to protect the public safety and committed actually billions to compensate the affected residents. But now we see that ExxonMobil, but also Shell, are now demanding that they should be exempt from their share of the costs. So instead, they want taxpayers, including the very people that were harmed by their operations, to pay the bill. And if there is one case that illustrates why ISDS is still a toxic acronym, it is this case. It allows polluters not only to profit from destructive activities, but also to offload the costs of their own responsibility onto the public. So 10 years from Malmström's remark, the conclusion is unavoidable. So cosmetic reforms to the system have not solved the problem. Exiting the Energy Charter Treaty was a necessary step, but not a sufficient one. The EU and its member states must now take the next step, and that's to terminate the remaining bilateral investment treaties and finally put an end to ISDS. Because in this age of crises and transitions, we cannot afford legal systems that privilege corporate profits over the public interest. We really need legal frameworks that empower governments to act boldly on climate, on inequality, on justice, without the shadow of billion-euro lawsuits hanging over their decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart-Jaap. You already made the bridge to the next presentation from Koert Vossen from Groninger Bodembeweging, who has experienced firsthand how companies like Exxon and Shell are operating. The floor is yours, Koert.
Opportunity to speak. Sorry, you can hear me now? For offering me the opportunity to speak to you on behalf of the people living in Groningen. And actually, I will come to that on behalf of the people living in Europe and even in all the world. And my story will be an illustration to the story of Bart-Jaap, showing that these threats are not abstract, far away. No, it affects all of us. It affects real people, and it may affect people very soon. My name is Koert Vossen. I'm the chair of the Groninger Bodembeweging. And the Groninger Bodembeweging is a civil society which represents the residents who have been directly or indirectly impacted by the gas extraction, 60 years of gas extraction in Groningen. Next slide, please. In the next 10-15 minutes, I will address 4 key points. First, I will take you to the consequences of gas extraction in Groningen, which we call and has been called officially through a parliamentary inquiry, a slow motion disaster. Secondly, there comes the parliamentary inquiry, which revealed that the full history and injustice of 60 years gas extraction and treatment of the Groningen people. Third, I will shortly touch upon the compensation measures announced by the government in reaction to the parliamentary inquiry. And then fourth, of course, what does ISDS then mean for Groningen or for the Netherlands as a whole? Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm one too early. Can you go one back? In 1960, the largest onshore natural gas field in Europe was discovered, and Shell, ExxonMobil, and the Dutch state entered into a secret agreement for the exploration and marketing of the gas. The parties founded one of the first public-private partnerships, which lasts until this very moment. Gas became the most important inland energy source for households and industries alike, and was exported to neighboring European countries. The revenues were huge. Large infrastructure works in the Netherlands and our social welfare schemes were paid with it. Already in 1963, warnings were voiced that gas extraction would cause soil subsidence. And you know, Netherlands is a low-lying country, so subsidence may be more severe in our country than elsewhere. The assertion was, of course, strongly denied by the oil companies, by the government, and by national scientific earth science institutes for many years. But finally, in the 70s, it was admitted it could no longer be denied because it was actually measured. In the 80s, during the 80s, the region in the north of the Netherlands was upset by a rumbling and vibrating underground. A geography teacher posed that these earthquakes were caused by gas extraction. And yes, the same denial process repeated, and the teacher concerned was publicly put aside as a dreamer, as an amateur. Nevertheless, as earthquakes became heavier and more frequent, a long study finally in 1993 led to the inevitable conclusion that gas extraction in the region was indeed the root cause of earthquakes. The public was, however, reassured that these earthquakes could only cause small cracks in brick-built houses. Well, you've seen the picture on my first slide. These cracks are not small. You can put your hand through it. Over the next two decades, the earthquakes became heavier and more frequent, and it culminated into up to now, the most powerful earthquake on the 16th of August, 2012. This event marked a turning point because it was clear to everyone that business as usual was no longer viable. The supervisor of mines urged the minister to reduce the gas production as much and as soon as possible in order to minimize the risk. And the Dutch State Safety Board issued a report concluding that the safety of residents might be at risk as a result of collapsing houses during an earthquake. From that moment on, official schemes for damage repairs, compensation, for reinforcement of houses started. But already in 2015, the Government Institute took over the reinforcement operation because NAM, the operator, a joint company of Shell, Exxon, and of Mobil Exxon and, sorry, I'm now mixing up. Shell and ExxonMobil did not hurry up very much to progress the reinforcement. So in 2015, the Government Institute took over, and in 2017, the government also took over the private handling by NAM of damage claims. Unfortunately, by taking it over, this led to lengthy, bureaucratic, and very legalistic procedures. In many cases, even to the highest administrative court. The outcome of damage claims for the inhabitants was often experienced as random and unjust. By 2019, after a series of serious earthquakes, the situation was such that the government announced the phase out of gas extraction as soon as possible, latest 2030. And the Dutch state and the two oil companies signed a framework agreement on the sharing of cost for damage, reinforcement, and measures to uplift the country. The region, Groningen region. Next slide, please. To give you an impression of the scale of the disaster, I show you a few numbers. These numbers date from the beginning of the 20th century, 2002 to be exact, and they were collected by the parliamentary inquiry. Total revenues for the Dutch Treasury amount to 363 billion euros. The profit for the oil companies over the years was 65 billion euros. Groningen area in Eurostat depicted as a very rich area. Yes, the gas was there, but only 1% was reinvested in the region. So people feel neglected too. 2.25 billion gas cubic meters has been extracted. By that time, over 1,600 earthquakes occurred, and by this time it's far beyond 1,700. More than 250,000 damage claims across about 85,000 houses. So 3 claims on average per house, but imagine in the center, of course, the average does not figure out what the real numbers were. For myself, I had 5 claims filed. Some 12,000 addresses at that time were unsafe, and over 7,000 addresses were still unsure whether they were safe or not. Well, bricks and stones, houses safety is one, but research of the Groningen University over the past decade shows that unsafe homes, tedious procedures, and uncertainty about the future had a negative impact on the well-being, the stress levels, the health of people, and trust in government institutions. Children are equally impacted because stress in the family, of feelings of insecurity in unsafe school buildings affects children during a very sensitive period. The same research group revealed also that the unequal outcomes of procedures, same cases, different outcomes, caused the social fabric in villages and in neighborhoods to break down. Anger, jealousy, and outright conflicts emerge in previously stable communities. Next slide, please. Finally, in 2021, the House of Representatives launched a parliamentary inquiry, the strongest method that the House of Representatives has to investigate cases. The committee collected tens of thousands of documents, conducted numerous secret and 69 public hearings of former ministers, high government officials, CEOs, and also affected people. The public hearings were live and fully broadcasted, so you can imagine the region was half of the time cloistered to the television screen. Next slide, please. In 2023, 24th of February, the Commission came to 5 key conclusions. There were more, but I will present here 5 key conclusions. First, the severity of the situation was consistently underestimated. Second, and there it comes, financial interest dominated decision-making during the whole 60 years of gas extraction. Third, unsafe condition of the peoples in Groningen persisted for too long. Fourth, the oil companies benefited from the entangled public-private interests. And fifth, the Netherlands, as a whole, owes a debt of honor to the region. Next slide. The government acknowledged the injustice by the wording of the state secretary of that time. He said, the Groningers, people in Groningen, were right all the time. And they announced 50 measures, including a milder, more human and simplified damage claim procedure, an accelerated reinforcement, and 30 years of social and economic recovery program. And finally, last year, 18 April, the legislation was passed to permanently close the Groningen gas field. So gas extraction from that huge field is history now, but there are tens of smaller gas fields still in operation and still being prolonged. Then the next one, please. And I come to ISDS. despite these, I may say, historical acknowledgements, 3 national and 1 international arbitration case have been filed. NAM, the operating company of Shell and ExxonMobil, started 2 arbitrations in 2022. It disputes the cost of damage and reinforcement. In 2023, Shell and ExxonMobil initiated the 3rd case amongst these claims, but also on lost income from the remaining gas in the field. And in 2024, Bart-Jaap also mentioned it, ExxonMobil, through its Belgian subsidiary, initiated an international ISDS concerning the cessation of the gas extraction in Groningen and the handling of the earthquake-related damages again. What does that bring us? Well, we are in an uncertainty again. For decades, financial interests had prevailed over our properties, our well-being, and our health. And now, once again, companies and the state are engaged in secret procedures that will affect our lives and our future. So again, we, as people living in the area, are the prime stakeholders who stand outside, waiting for the outcome of a procedure of which we already know that financial interests are dominant. So a milder, more human and simplified damage procedure, accelerating the reinforcements of our homes, and bring back safety to thousands of residents, and the generation-long recovery program for the region are seriously at stake. Arbitration, as we feel it in the region which is affected, does not take into account the social or moral arguments that were brought forward by the parliamentary inquiry and which were handled by the House of Representatives, let alone the honor of debt, which was an important part of the conclusion of the parliamentary inquiry. Companies don't have an honor of debt. They do sometimes say so, but we experience they don't have that. The people of Groningen are sure that a verdict of a private court in favor of the oil company will lead to a setback of measures which were democratically and rightfully put in place. Can I have the next slide, please? Just one click. They can be sure that the right which was granted to us with a capital R will be undone. So please, on behalf of the people of Groningen, on behalf of the people in the Netherlands, Europe, or far away, who have suffered so much for so long, I urge you, the members of the European Parliament, to ensure that money does not outweigh the right and dignity of the people here, or there, in fact, in Groningen, and across Europe. Next slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Koert. If there was anyone in the room who still wasn't convinced that ISDS mechanisms are not the right way to go, then this story must wake you up. But there's more stories. I mentioned already that we presented 10 cases. Jean, coordinator of ETJC, is going to highlight a couple of other ones that in other policy areas that we revealed last week. Jean?
Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, we've been seeing some general trends of more companies suing using ISDS in some areas of public policy that perhaps people in the room might be a bit less familiar with. So this is storytelling time. Gather round, friends, as I tell you 3 tales of companies suing over tax, sanctions, and security policy. So first tale, and this is a little bit of a segue from the stories around energy that we've just been hearing, because the tax involved is the windfall tax. So back at the start of 2022, if you remember, energy prices skyrocketed. The impacts on ordinary people were immediate and direct. In some countries, household electricity bills doubled, fuel prices were the most expensive that they ever were. EU institutions estimated that potentially an additional 11 million people might be tipped into poverty in the because of the impact of those prices. At the same time, this is a bonanza for energy companies. Energy sector earnings in Europe in that year increased by 226%, which was 5 times higher than the nearest closest sector. So calls for a windfall tax were pretty widespread. And the EU introduced a windfall tax in the autumn of that year. Following year, they were sued using ISDS by Klesch Group, which owns 2 oil refineries, one in Germany, one in Denmark, who said that the windfall tax was a pretext for attacking honest earnings of energy companies, despite the fact that the annual report for one of the oil refineries acknowledged that their earnings growth in the year was due to the increase in prices that were due to the general price increase, nothing to do with anything they had personally actually done. Klesch Group is a private equity firm. It is based in the tax haven of Jersey. It's owned by a guy called Gary Klesch, who the New York Times calls a financial vulture. He has a long history in trading in bankruptcies. One of the first things that is the result of bringing the ISDS case is that the tribunal has said it's fine for Klesch Group not to pay the tax. Klesch Group said, but what if we win the case? We might have difficulty getting the money back from the government. And the tribunal said, oh, yeah, you're right. No, you don't have to pay because you can't trust the German government, can you? The German government's counterpoint that, well, what if they lose the case and we can't get the money out of them? I mean, are there any grounds for thinking that? Well, Gary Klesch's mode of operation, he's an asset stripper. He buys up companies on the cheap, creams off anything actually of value still in the company and junks them. And he bought both of these refineries on the cheap. Private equity, so not very much financial information available, but the most recent information that we have available about one of the refineries, that refinery has 10 times the average debt levels for the sector. It is paying out half of its earnings as a management fee to the tax haven in Jersey, and it is paying what a financial analyst company, not me, described as whopping dividends. So yes, the asset stripper is asset stripping. It's quite likely that by the time that the ISDS case plays out over the many years that we know tends to take, that if Klesch does lose the case, they'll say, oh, sorry, no money left. So I think in this case, this is ISDS being used by a financial vulture who's like, oh, I might be able to get some more cash out of that, because if he wins the award will go straight to the tax haven in Jersey, not to either of the active businesses. And if he loses, he's maybe found a way of avoiding paying tax. So that was story number 1. Story number 2. Mikhail Fridman is a Russian oligarch. He was one of the original oligarchs said to be bankrolling Yeltsin back in the day, and 30 years later, he still makes it into Forbes's list of the top 10 richest people in Russia. He and his partner, Peter Raven, set up Alfa Bank, which is the largest private bank in Russia, and Alfa Group, which is this sprawling business empire. In the 2000s, he restructured much of that business empire to be based under a holding company in Luxembourg. Fast forward to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mikhail Fridman was put on the sanctions list, and Luxembourg froze all of his assets. This made him very unhappy, and he has been trying to challenge that in every way that he can ever since, and including last year, he brought a, is it last year, or is it more than a year ago? Anyway, yeah, a ISDS case against Luxembourg. He is asking for 16 billion, which is a ridiculous amount. It is equivalent to half of the central government revenue of Luxembourg. It's also slightly more than Forbes estimates that he is worth. So he's basically asking the taxpayers of Luxembourg to stake him all of his money back. It's not the only case. This is distinctly a trend. There have been 10 cases being filed around sanctions, 4 of which include Michael Friedman, another one potentially being threatened. So this is, something that is starting to happen, and I know Javier is going to say a lot more about the background of this. Third story, cybersecurity, looking particularly at 5G, the communications network, which the installation and building of the 5G network was a much more political and sensitive issue than the previous 4G network. 4G was built sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, and 5G comes along 10 years later. 2 key changes in those 10 years. Firstly, our lives went completely online. If I think back to sort of what I was doing when 4G was being built, well, I did things online, but they were discrete, separate things. Now, online is just completely integrated in everything that I do and everything everybody does. So the communications network is carrying so much more and more sensitive data. It's all the human data, the personal data, government data, business data, but it's also critical infrastructure, energy grids, railways, sewage networks, all go through that community. So it's a much more sensitive thing. Second trend in those 10 years, the rise of China. So it becomes clear by the time that people are looking at, well, how are we going to be building the next generation, that the equipment that would be used to build it is very likely to be made in China. By the late 2010s, Huawei has a 30% global market share in communications equipment. And this worries people because of the likelihood that the people who made your equipment could potentially have put a backdoor in, which of course Huawei always denies that they ever have or ever would do. So the EU has a long and thorough process in the way that the EU does to look into this. What are the risks? Are the concerns serious? If so, what should we do about it? Parliament, Commission, Council, back to the Commission, reports, recommendations, information gathering. Eventual outcome, yes, the 5G network is at risk of attack, and governments should explicitly incorporate into their processes for setting up the licenses and auctions for the 5G network to take into account security concerns in order to take whatever measures they consider necessary. Almost all EU countries have incorporated those recommendations into law, and at least 10 have taken some kind of measure that would exclude Huawei. One of the first to do so was Sweden. So Sweden set up the auction of the 5G licenses, saying that you could only bid for a license if you committed to not using components made by Huawei. Huawei has challenged this. They tried to take out an injunction. They failed. They brought a national court case. They lost the court case. The court upheld the right of the security services in Sweden to make judgments about national security for Sweden. So Huawei would not take no for an answer, and Huawei has the option of turning to ISDS, which they have now done. So they are continuing to challenge. It's not just in Sweden. They have also, we know from Freedom of Information requests, brought preliminary measures against the UK. They have threatened Costa Rica. We're potentially seeing chilling effects. For instance, the Czech Republic issued warnings against Huawei. Huawei very publicly threatened to sue. Czech Republic has not actually acted upon those warnings in the years since. So I think these areas of cybersecurity are very fast moving. There's something where the governments are needing to shift and react to changing circumstances. And the precedent being set here, again, is one that tries to chill and close down the policy space. So yes, those are my 3 stories. I stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. If you're fascinated or thrilled or appalled by the Friedman example that Jean mentioned already, we have Javier Garcia Olmedo from the University of Luxembourg, who has been diving more into the issue of how the bilateral investment treaties of EU member states, of how they might not be in accordance with EU law on sanctions. So Javier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. And how are we with time? Because
we're doing okay.
We're doing okay?
Behind
Because I know you assigned me 20 minutes, but I can be shorter.
15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, let's do it in 15 minutes. So thank you very much for the invitation, Paul and Fabian and the organizers. And it is a pleasure to be here today to speak on a very important topic relating to ISDS, and that topic is sanctions and investment law, in particular how sanctions can lead to investment claims under BITs. And I apologize if what I am going to be covering today, if you're already familiar with that, but I think it's useful to just give a general overview of what sanctions are. You may be familiar with sanctions and the different mechanisms, and in particular in the EU, sanctions that have been adopted against Russia. But again, I think it's useful to give an overview of what sanctions are and the scope and mechanisms of these measures. So sanctions, to give a very general definition, are restrictive measures that are adopted by one or more countries against a state, an individual, or an entity with the purpose that the state, the individual, or the entity refrain from violating laws, policies, or in case that they pose a threat to peace and security. And there are 2 different types of sanctions, which are important to, it's important to distinguish them. One is collective sanctions, and the other is unilateral sanctions. The ones we are concerned today with are unilateral sanctions. So collective sanctions are authorized, are adopted under the UN framework, under Article 41 of the UN Charter, and they are binding on all UN member states, and they have as main purpose to maintain and restore international peace and security. There are different types of collective sanctions that can be adopted. They have a non-military purpose, that's important to mention. And types of sanctions, collective ones that can be adopted: asset freeze, travel bans, and trade restrictions. And you may have heard of the sanctions that have been imposed in the past against North Korea and Iran. And then we have unilateral sanctions. And as I mentioned, those are the ones we are going to discuss today, we're concerned with. The legal basis for unilateral sanctions, as opposed to collective sanctions, is not the UN Charter, it's national laws or regional organizational mandates. They're adopted by regional organizations, like in this case, the EU. And they're binding on all, not on all countries, but only on those countries that have adopted the sanction, or countries that belong to the organization that has adopted the sanctions. And they have a similar purpose to international collective sanctions. The main goal is to ensure peace and security, but they can also pursue other goals, more political. And the types of sanctions in unilateral sanctions that are adopted are very similar to the types of collective sanctions. They can be asset freezes, travel bans, and trade restrictions. And we are now going to discuss these sanctions that have been adopted by the EU. Next slide, please. So briefly, in the EU, sanctions are adopted by the Council of the European Union, and there are two under the framework of the treaties, in particular, the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So Article 29 of the Treaty on the European Union gives the Council the right to adopt restrictive measures, sanctions against non-EU countries, entities, and individuals under the Common Foreign and Security Policy framework. And Article 215 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union allows the Council to adopt measures to ensure that all member states comply and implement those sanctions. And here you can see on the slide two regulations that have been adopted in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. One is Council Regulation 223036, and the other one is Council Regulation 833/2014. And those two regulations are different. The sanctions that are adopted under those regulations differ. Please, next slide. So Regulation 22/336, that regulations concern sanctions that are adopted only against individuals or entities. And the type of measures that are adopted in the framework of that regulation are asset freezes, in particular, but also travel bans and prohibition on making funds available. And as you may have heard, there is a listing that you can see in the annex to the regulation where these individuals or entities that have been sanctioned are included in that listing. As Jim mentioned, Friedman was sanctioned under this regulation and is still under the sanction list. And those sanctions have to be implemented by the designated competent national authorities in the respective member state. And it's interesting to note that as of today, there are more than 2,500 either individuals or entities that have been sanctioned under that regulation. So this is one regulation that concerns EU sanction. The other regulation, 833/2014, that regulation relates to sanctions that are adopted against Russia, the state, and its economy, not against individuals and companies. And the measures that we have seen that have been adopted against Russia and its economy include trade and import restrictions, financial restrictions, and also investment bans. And similar to the sanctions that are imposed under the other regulation, the sanctions imposed under this regulation have to be implemented by the designated competent national authorities in the respective member state. Next slide, please. So now this is when it comes the interesting aspect of sanctions and investment law, how they interlink. So sanctions that are adopted by the UN Security Council under the UN framework, those sanctions are presumed to be legal under international law. With respect to unilateral sanctions, it's not as simple. There is a debate by scholars and states as to whether unilateral sanctions are in fact legal under international law. We're not going to get into that now. I just wanted to mention it. I think it's important. But unilateral sanctions, whether or not they are legal under international law, they can also lead to breaches of international law, and in particular to breaches of norms that we can find in investment treaties. And I'm going now to, next slide, please. I think you have to press again to come up. Yeah. So what type of investment treaties, BITs, can lead or can be the target of sanctions? And please keep in mind that sanctions are a policy measure. It's a regulation that is adopted by a state. So member state adopts, they implement the sanctions that has been adopted by the council. And it is a policy measure that may affect an investment, like freezing assets, for example, what happened to Friedman. So they can lead to a claim under an investment treaty. So there are two types of investment treaties that can be subject to sanctions claim. One is investment treaties signed between Russia and EU member states. There are currently 18 BITs in 4 signed with EU countries. And these BITs, if you look at them, they are very similar to most of the BITs that we know. They contain very broad procedural and substantive protections. They protect investors, both natural and legal persons. The investor, natural person, they must have the nationality of the home country, in this case, Russia. And if they are a company, they have to be constituted in Russia. And they protect all type of assets, including shares, very important to keep that in mind. Investment shares that are held in the country that has adopted the measure, the sanction, affecting or damaging the investment. And procedural protections, ISDS, most commonly these BITs include ICSID and ancitral, and then the typical substantive protection provisions, expropriation, FET, and MFN. You have to click for this slide. Thank you. And then the other type of BITs that can be subject to sanctions are the investment treaties concluded between Belarus and EU member states. There are 17 BITs in force with Belarus and very similar provisions. They protect investors, investments, very broad definition of investors and investments, broad procedural protections, ICSID and ancitral, and substantive protections, very similar as well, expropriation, FET, and MFN. So next slide, please. So now, these BITs have already been invoked, as we mentioned already, in cases that are currently they're pending. One of those cases, Jean already mentioned it, is an investment claim brought by Friedman, Russian oligarch. He also has Israeli nationality, and he brought the claim under the Belgian and Luxembourg Economic Union, the BLO, as is known, Russia BIT, that was adopted in 1989. This case is is a case that was initiated under the ancestral arbitration rule. So it's an ad hoc arbitration. It's not an institutional arbitration like ICSID, for example. The investments that he claims have been damaged by the freezing of his assets in Luxembourg are 2 in particular. One is the Luxembourg-based investment company, Letter One, and the other one is the Luxembourg-based company, investment company, ABH Holdings. So the assets, the shares that he had in those companies have been frozen by Luxembourg, and that was the reason why he brought this claim against the state. And of course, those assets were frozen based on the regulation that I discussed before, Regulation 2022-336. He's claiming that the freezing of his assets in Luxembourg they have led to a violation of the expropriation, FET, and full protection and security provisions that you can find in the treaty. And as I was mentioned, he's claiming $16 billion in compensation. That is one case under a Russia BIT concluded with member states. Next slide, please. Another case has been brought by a Belarusian company. It's a state-owned company that invests it's a producer of potash. And here, this company concluded a contract with Lithuania, a long-term fertilizer transport contract with the Lithuanian Railways, and they were expecting profit from the transportation of Belarusian potash from Belarus to Lithuania. Based on the sanctions that were adopted by the US, and also based on the second regulation that I mentioned that targets in particular the Russian economy, and within that regulation, we have seen sanctions like trade restrictions, import restrictions. So based on those 2 sanctions framework, Lithuania canceled the contract with this company, with this fertilizer company, and this company brought a claim under the Belarus-Lithuania BIT concluded in 1999. And this company is claiming $12.1 billion in compensation. These are not, next slide, please. These are not the only cases that we are going to see against member states. You may have heard that 2 Russian nationals have threatened Belgium to bring a claim under the Belgian-Luxembourg Economic Union Russia BIT, the same one that was invoked in the Friedman case. We don't know who these Russian nationals are, and we know that what they are arguing what they are going to argue if the case, well, they have already submitted a letter of dispute to the Belgian government, threatening Belgium to bring the claim if their assets, which are frozen, they're held in Euroclear, are not released. So I don't know what is going to happen with those assets. I don't know if Belgium would agree to release those assets. If Belgium doesn't, it's likely that this is going to go to arbitration as well. Next slide, please. But it's important to note that the BITs concluded between Russia and member states and Belarus and member states are not the only BITs that can be subject to sanctions. We have more than 1,200 BITs that have been concluded between member states and EU member states and non-EU countries, not only Russia and Belarus. Next slide, please. So this is a case that was brought by a Luxembourg-based bank, ABH Holdings, that was already mentioned, I think, against Ukraine. Under the Belgian-Luxembourg Economic Union Ukraine BIT. This is an ICSID case that was brought by this Luxembourg-based bank because this bank has a subsidiary in Ukraine, Sense Bank, and that subsidiary, Sense Bank, was expropriated by Ukraine under a legislation that targets banks owned by individuals on Western sanction list. And this company is claiming violations of the BIT, the FET, expropriation and full protection and security, and is claiming €1 billion dollars in compensation. Now, if you look at the request for arbitration, next slide, please, you will see that in that case, two shareholders of ABH Holdings are Friedman and Bert Aben. Both of them were, well, Friedman we know is already in the sanction list, and Aben as well is in the EU sanction list. And this measure that was taken by Ukraine was taken against Sense Bank because the shareholders of Sense Bank are Russian nationals that are in the sanction list. And next slide, and with that I will finish. So it's important to keep in mind that you can have, well, the BITs, they protect indirect investments. And direct investments include situations where the investor channels funds through intermediaries that hold shares in the host state. And tribunals recognize broadly that indirect investment are protected under BITs. So you can have a situation like the one you see there in that graph, on that graph. So you can have a situation where corporate structure is composed of different companies and shareholders. Some may be Russian nationals that have been sanctioned, but the claim doesn't necessarily need to be brought by the sanctioned national. It could be brought, like in the case of Luxembourg, by a company incorporated in the member state who acts as a claimant, but that company will be owned by a Russian sanctioned individual. So you can imagine that the scope of investment claims that can be brought under sanctions is very, very broad, considering that indirect investments are also protected under BITs. And I had 1 minute, and I'm going to leave it there now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. We're a little bit behind schedule. Don't worry about that. I've never been in a debate in the European Parliament where half-time the debate was not behind schedule. So we're gonna allow for 2 or 3 questions now. There's more question time at the end after the rest of the presentations. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question now already? Yep. Please.
Hi, hello. I'm the assistant of Anna Cavazzini, who is coming next. Do you know if the Commission is intervening in the sanction cases, and what is their take on the cases? Thank you.
No idea. I have tried to find information about the Friedman case, but very difficult. We don't know we don't even know if the case is still ongoing. We think it is, but we don't know more than that. Much more.
I was just going to add the Friedman case is being held under the Hong Kong body, so which publishes no information whatsoever about cases.
Thanks. Probably Javier might have the answer. I mean, I'm guessing the answer is going to be no, because I have so little faith in ISDS tribunals. But I was wondering if you think that, so with the sanctions cases, obviously the intention of the sanction is to deny the investor the enjoyment of the benefits of their investment, whereas it could be construed in other cases that the policy has a different purpose and the denial of the benefits is an unfortunate side effect of that. Do you think that would have any impact in how the tribunal considers how it awards the case or not?
Well, yes, that's one of the potential defenses that they can raise during the case, and which is known as the police powers doctrine. So basically, what the state would argue is that the reason for adopting sanctions was to deter Russia from continuing with the war in Ukraine and invasion. So it was a legitimate public policy measure. But if you look at I mean, you need to consider that this is very exceptional. So we don't have, as far as I know, cases leading to investment claims based on sanction measures. So, but if you look at the previous case law on the police powers doctrine, the arguments that defense is going to be difficult to sustain, I think, because tribunals, they tend to disagree with when state they try to justify measures that lead to an expropriation or to damage the investment on the basis of that doctrine, on the basis that it was a public policy measure. And even when you have cases that the tribunal agreed that the measure was taken for a public purpose, compensation is due. So the tribunal would agree that compensation has to be paid. But I don't know in this case, because it's very exceptional and it's very political, if tribunals in those cases will adopt that restrictive approach or not.
Yeah, I also have a question for Javier, which is, can you say anything about the EU's reaction to arbitration cases regarding sanctions? Because I think there was language included in the 15th and 18th sanction package.
Oh yes, I didn't have time for that.
And maybe just briefly a second question to Kurt. Could you say anything about what the reception was of local people in Groningen when they found out about the arbitration cases? How people relate to it, or what their thinking about it is? Yeah.
So I don't know if it's possible to put the slide. Who's managing the slide? Is it possible? Can you go one more slide? Oh, continue. One more. What before that one? That one. So yes, Fabian's questions. The EU has adopted the 18th package, sanction package, and it's interesting. It's an interesting one because it provides that member states cannot enforce awards arising out of sanctions-related measures. And now, how this is going to work in practice, I don't know. I think it's a bit extreme. And in any event, we cannot forget that this is only applicable within the EU, and investors can always go outside the EU and try to enforce an award in other territories jurisdiction that may not have the same view as the EU. But yes, this is the latest and the sanction package that was adopted by the EU, and that's the approach they have taken. They are asking member states not to enforce those awards, and then we see what will happen.
Sorry, just who's going to recover the damages and legal costs if they did take it? Is it the EU Commission from the EU business?
We don't know, and this is another aspect of the sanction package. I don't know on which basis they can claim damages against the investors. It's very broad if you read the provision, and as to your question, I don't know what the damages are gonna. I don't know who's going to receive them. Perhaps the state, in this case, Luxembourg, if he's found liable and has to pay compensation. I don't know. And I don't even know what type of damage can be claimed in this situation. So legal cost, arbitration cost, legal fees, I don't really know. It's not explained in the regulation.
Okay, thank you. I would, oh, sorry. Good.
Yes, that was also a question for me. Well, I can say ISDS is far away from most people's minds, especially for people who are still living in trouble with damage or an unsafe house or unsafe or unsecure future. But to a certain extent, fortunately, last Friday, the State Secretary issued a letter to the House of Representatives on the subject of the arbitration and other cases that are running around Groningen gas exploration. And up to 3 times he mentions that these cases can have budgetary consequences. So that has waken up at least the local media. So today and last Saturday, the newspapers and the radio are mentioning what is happening on this level. So this will wake up at least some people. But as I said, to start with, it's far away from people's mind. But in the long term, they may feel the consequences.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Sorry. Yeah, but I would like to let's keep these questions for the last part, because I really want to give time to the other 2 presenters, if that's okay. I would like to invite Clementine Baldon. No, you can. Javier, you can also maybe stay here because there might be more questions coming on sanction issues. And Stephanie, can I invite you as well to come?
Enough chairs then?
Yeah, there's two others are sitting there. Yeah. Okay. So Clementine has been advising us on what kind of legal options there are possible to address the issue of ISDS included in bilateral investment treaties. So she's going to present some of these options.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone. So, yes, I'll do a quick focus on the legality and illegality of this treaty. So, next slide. How long do I have, Paul?
15 minutes.
Okay, great. So actually, last year, exactly on the 23rd of September of 2024, we did a presentation with the same conclusion that member states, all BITs, are not compatible with the EU law. And next slide, please. Yeah, the starting point for that is actually quite an old opinion from the European Court of Justice. It's an opinion which was rendered in the framework of the CETA, you know, the trade agreement with Canada, which includes some types of ISDS mechanism. And in this agreement, the Parliament referred a question to the Court of Justice and asked for an opinion, on the legality of the ISDS mechanism in the agreement. And the opinion 117, which was rendered in April 2019, contained very important findings. The most important for us is that it sets out a legal test that should be followed to check whether a type of dispute resolution between investors and states, such as ISDS, is compatible with EU law. And the main condition that are contained in this test are the following. First, the agreement must not confer on tribunals the power to interpret or apply EU law. And second one, the agreement must not enable arbitration tribunals to call into question the level of protection of public interest established by the EU institution. And thus, it may not give rise to awards that would order the EU or member states to amend or withdraw EU law. In the context of the CETA, the European Court of Justice found that it was okay, that the CETA, as it was as we call new generation free trade agreement, contains some safeguards. I mean, we can think that this is questionable, but at least it contains some safeguards, such as the right to regulate, some general exceptions, some specification, for example, a definition on what is indirect expropriation, etc. So the tribunal found that it was okay, that the CETA mechanism did comply with this legal test. Next slide, please. And now let's turn to what would happen if we apply this test to all bilateral investment treaties. First, we believe that there are very credible and strong and compelling arguments that this test should also apply not only to investment agreement concluded between the EU and third parties, but also to bilateral investment treaties concluded by member states. Why? Because these BITs allow investors to challenge EU measures or domestic measures implementing EU law. We've seen plenty of examples, the Clash case, all the cases regarding sanctions. So it is really now totally observable that these BITs do influence EU laws. And it's true that to be totally complete, those that knows these issues, that there have been two rulings that have been handed down one by the German Federal Court, another one by the German Constitutional Court, that do not take this view and that they interpret the Comstroy ruling as shielding extra EU BITs from challenge under EU law. But we think that this is not, I mean, we can enter into details for the question, but this is really not in line with the findings in Opinion 117 from the European Court of Justice. And what would happen if this legal test was to be imposed, when to be applied to BITs? It's very clear that all those BITs, the so-called first generation BITs, would not pass the test. Why? Because these all BITs do call into question the level of protection of public interest sought by the EU. We had plenty of examples, that's very clear, the Clash ruling, etc. And it means that these old treaties, they just do not comply with what we call the EU legal order. Next slide, please. And now let's turn to sanctions. Because sanctions, we had very interesting presentations on the interference of ISDS and BITs with the capacity of EU to impose sanctions. Next slide, please. And the conclusion that we have to draw from this is that also from this reason as well, for the fact that these treaties interfere with the capacity of the Council to impose sanctions, for this reason as well, these BITs are not compatible with EU law. And actually, we have an old, very old case law dating back from 2009, where the European Court of Justice ruled expressly that Austria, it was against Austria, Sweden, and Finland, and it was regarding their extra EU BITs concluded prior to the accession to the EU. And the rulings really found that these treaties were incompatible with EU law. Why? Because they included capital transfer clauses, which were found to have a capacity to interfere with the Council powers to unilaterally adopt restrictive measures with regard to third countries in specific circumstances. And what's interesting, at that time, it was kind of a theoretical case. There was no really case study. And now that we see the new cases that are appearing in the context of sanctions against Russia, we see that it's really true. And this is still totally relevant. And what's interesting as well is that we had those rulings, but nothing happened then. Even Sweden acknowledged that they are not in line with the EU law, but they did nothing. And so this is still relevant. And this is not only relevant to Austria, Sweden, and Finland. We don't really know why they were chosen. It was a case study. It's also relevant to most of all BITs concluded by member states, because none of them, really none of them, contain the kind of exception that could have been accepted by the court because like an acknowledgement of the capacity to impose sanction in certain circumstances. So they are just not in line with EU law as they interfere with the Council powers to adopt sanctions. Next slide, please. Yes, this one I don't even have to enter into details because we had a complete presentation of that now the Commission itself, it's interesting in the 18th package on sanctions against Russia itself, it again acknowledged that these treaties are problematic for the EU capacity to impose sanctions, and that's why it tries by complex ways just to neutralize BITs, but it's not complete at all, because even if member states are ordered not to pay the award, if, as you know, the awards are enforced outside of the EU and the member states won't be able to use effectively this kind of defense, and it's what's happening, for example, as for ACMEA. And there are now plenty of illustration. We had the illustration of cases directly targeting sanctions, but we have also other cases in which Russian oligarchs targeted by sanctions also used ISDS in other type of case. For example, in France, we had our first ISDS case targeted by a several group, which is held by a Russian oligarch and targeting the refusal to grant a permit in relation to a golden mine in French Guiana, which is taking into account environmental reason, and the group is requesting 4 billion euros. So it's ongoing. It hadn't been on hold while for a moment at the beginning of the war, but now the case has resumed, and France might be ordered to compensate a Russian oligarch for just denying the permits to renew the golden mine. Next slides, please. And the one after, please. So now what can we do out of that? There is actually, so there is a clear incompatibility, at least of old bilateral investment treaties with EU law. I mean, that's clear on interference and also specifically on the sanctions. And there is also an obligation on member states to remedy incompatibilities. And this is clear. This is true for all BITs concluded prior to the European accession. There is the Article 351 of the TFEU, which states that member states are required to take all appropriate steps to eliminate the incompatibilities with EU law contained in international agreements concluded before the EU accession. And actually, the rulings of the European Courts of Justice of 2009 recognized that. They recognized that Sweden, Austria, and Finland had and failed to take steps to eliminate these incompatibilities. So that's really clear. And we have also other provision in the treaties that oblige states to remedy the incompatibilities with the EU law, even after EU accession. And in particular, it stems from the principle of loyalties between member states and the EU, which is enshrined in Article 4.3 of the treaty. And how member states are supposed to remedy to these incompatibilities. Here, the rulings of 2009 are also very instructive because the court at that stage did mention that states could remedy these incompatibilities through interpretation by domestic courts where possible, renegotiation through diplomatic means to align agreements with their obligation under EU law, and also last steps, termination or denunciation of treaties which are obviously incompatible with EU laws. Last slide, please. Yes. So member states are obliged to remedy the incompatibilities, but if they don't, which is what is happening now for a long time, what should the Commission do? The Commission's role is to ensure that member states do comply with EU law. It's its role, and that's why it is upon the Commission to have the responsibility to launch infringement proceedings, which it does in certain areas. And that's why the Commission should safeguard that member states' BITs are in line with EU treaties and EU law. And actually, the Commission does it for new treaties and even for renegotiated BITs under the what is called the grandfathering regulation. The new BITs are supposed to go under the scrutiny of the Commission, and the Commission does review whether or not they are in line with EU law. But as you know, as was stated, there is a very high stock of all BITs that have to be reviewed as well and that do interfere with the EU law. So as member states have really failed to remedy with their incompatibilities, whereas they knew, at least since 2009, and also with the 2019, with the opinion of the European Courts of Justice and Sept. So now, with the real risk now of the undermining EU's powers to impose effective sanctions and increasing interference of BITs with EU law that we have seen against recently with the Clash one, it's urgent that the Commission's act and does use its powers to launch infringement proceedings against EU states that do not even try to remedy the incompatibilities of their old BITs with EU law. And that's all the point of the work we're doing now to try to convince and the Commission to complete its mission, and that's why we're planning to launch an infringement complaint on this, on the fact that these old treaties are not complying with EU law. Thank you.
Thank you, Clementine. We're gonna do a short change in the program, so I'm asking Jennifer to still hold back for a second, talking about an infringement procedure in France, because we have Anna Cavazzini, MEP from the Greens, who has been very supportive in our ECT campaign in the past. But she's very pressed in her time, so would like to give you the opportunity to react to. So far as what you've heard, we've been making the argument that ISDS is not just undermining climate policies, but also policies on taxes, on sanctions, on national security. Concrete cases have been presented which are proving that point. We also see that the bilaterals are violating EU law on sanctions, so that's why we are starting infringement calls on the Commission, and would be very happy to get your response to that or your ideas.
Thank you so much for the invitation and also for organizing this important conference. It's so important that civil society, academics and other hold this topic high on the agenda, because indeed, as you said, with a lot of you in the room that I see, we were very successful in the last term, civil society, academics, the parliament, to make the seemingly impossible possible, to exit the Energy Charter Treaty. But of course, as you said, the work doesn't stop there. as you probably know, we still have an investment monitoring group in this parliament that I'm chairing. And you all know my assistant, Lucille, who's also here at the conference, I think, the whole day, and also connecting with all of you, where we try to also keep the topic still alive in the parliament. And I think the cases that you're bringing forward actually makes it probably easier for us, because unfortunately, climate is not the first topic on the agenda anymore, although we as Greens are fighting for that every day to reverse this. And nevertheless, I think these cases that you're mentioning, sanctions, tax, other areas, can probably also relate better to some of the MEPs that unfortunately don't care so much about climate, but are still, of course, shocked and intrigued by the sanction cases. I can let you know that we had a lot of sessions in this monitoring group also on the member states. So repeatedly, we as MEPs are asking the Commission to start infringement procedures, to whatsoever, but they're always very hesitant, I would say. They tell me, yeah, they are, provided this, that they help the member states renegotiating if they want. They have a kind of framework, new BIT that they offer the member states. So they're doing this more diplomatic help, but they're not hard on the member states. And as you know, we still have this hook from last term. The Parliament had a very strong resolution on reforming the investment protection system. And in this resolution, also with a lot of help of you, we got this through the Parliament. Thanks for that. And in this resolution, we actually also call for reform of the member states' bids. So I think the Parliament, we can always still refer to the official Parliament position that is actually asking that. So yeah, I can just basically say thank you that you're keeping the topic alive. We try to do the same in the Parliament, and I think we probably at this conference, and I'm so sorry that I have to run off, but it's just a very stupid meeting day for me with a lot of other committees and whatsoever, that you strategize here, and we try to really build on this idea of how we can put more pressure on the Commission to then put more pressure on the member states. There might be another moment of opportunity probably in the coming months, next year, I don't know, 2 years, when the Multilateral Investment Court is moving ahead, because this is also actually what my monitoring group is about, that we monitor what the Commission is actually negotiating. I guess the civil society, we as Greens also have a kind of contradictory relationship to the Multilateral Investment Court, but nevertheless, I think it couldn't be another moment to also basically talk about the topic and bring the topic on the top of the agenda. So with that, I can just wish you all the best. Again, I will also look at the slides later, and Lucille is writing down everything. We keep your good input and use it definitely for our work in the Parliament. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Anna. Stephanie, apologies, I got your name wrong. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're planning in Veblen Institute is planning in France?
Yes, I don't know if you received the slides presentation. Yes, it's Mathilde Dupré from Veblen. Perfect. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present the French situation really quickly. So first, France has never really been a direct target of ISDS cases. If you can go to the next slide, please. But the situation is changing, as you can see on this table. So France is starting to change status, just so other EU countries. Clémentine talked to you about the Montagne d'Or cases involving two Russian financial holdings over the cancellation of a highly controversial open pit gold mine in French Guyana. And more recently, we have the case of a Russo-Armenian oligarch who initiated a dispute over the seizure of his assets. So at Veblen Institute, we have worked extensively to prevent the ratification of new agreement containing ISDS clause as well on the modernization and withdrawal from the ECT. And now we are focusing on the stock of existing French bits. And in July, we published a study providing an initial assessment. And it is these findings that I will now briefly share with you. Next slide, please. So France is currently a party to 90 investment protection agreements with 94 countries, of which 84 are currently in force. Next slide, please. And as we suspected, the French stock of agreement is inconsistent with EU law and international law. To be more precise, it's incompatible with the with the requirements set by the CGEU on its opinion 117. It's also inconsistent with the commitments made under the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1.c. And it is also inconsistent with the EU law and with the position of the EU with the European Parliament and with its resolution in 2022 on the future of European investment policy. And indeed, this is the case for all the agreements currently in force to which France is a party. And France, for example, is the third country whose investment treaty network protects the highest volume of fossil fuel emissions. We relied on a study from E3G, which was published 1 year ago. And from that study, we know that 188 million tons of potential emission, or 9.4% of the total, concern French investment covered by French BIT. Next slide, please. So here you can see the agreement by agreement breakdown on the screen. Sorry, it's very small. But we were also surprised to discover just how archaic some French BITs are. Some example, in the stock of French BIT, we found that some are non-reciprocal agreements, meaning that they are protecting French investment in the third country, but not those of the third country in France. We also found that there are a lot of agreements, including stabilization clauses, guaranteeing French investors protections against any changes in the host country regulation. We also found that many agreements are retroactive, that they are offering protection even for investments made before their signature. Sorry. And we also found agreement with unlimited sunset clause, as you can see in the next slide. So having been alerted by earlier work on the risk of incompatibility of BIT with international sanction measures, we are now examining this additional issue. It also appears that French BITs are problematic in this respect. And this is for all these reasons that we call on the French government to unilaterally terminate the 76 agreements whose initially scheduled duration has already expired, and also to plan for the denunciation of the remaining agreements as and when possible. And we believe that in the absence of action by France, the European Commission should require France, as well as other member states, to put an end to these outdated BITs. And that is why we are preparing to launch an infringement procedure together with the Baldon law firm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have 9 minutes plus 5 extra that we got granted, so we have 14 more minutes. There were already 2 questions over there. Do you want to start?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, my question is for Kurt. Yeah, well, this is very special because usually, as you can see, we talk about ISDS and investment deals and sanctions and all of this technical language. So for us to have you here, it's very special. Usually we work with people already fighting against ISDS outside Europe. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you are one of the first ones in these 25 years that we actually have in the room to tell the experience of how the damages of the company actually sort of trickle down into your houses. So for me to say that is very special. But my question is, you mentioned that at one point in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, the government issued a report and it gave you the right. It said basically you've been always right, that the decisions were made on financial basis. But what I'm really curious about is to see how your relationship with the government is right now, because the Dutch, being the architects of ISDS as a system, now are being sued. So how is this government reacting to the fact that they are being sued when there is a long-standing grievance from the population of Groningen?
Yeah, there it is. Well, our relation with the government is, of course, critical. We've always been critical, and as you may have noticed from my story, for a reason. The government at this moment keeps very quiet about these cases. Of course, there's a secrecy around the case, but well, one of the first things we heard was the letter last Friday, as I mentioned, where some concern is trickling through, and maybe this might, in the Groningen case, be helpful for abolishing these kind of investment treaties. But I'm not sure about that. But I hope this concrete case will further form the opinion also of the government that, well, there are things very wrong for our people, with these treaties. Is that an answer to your question?
Yes, I was really looking into how they are reacting, because I'm assuming that you have a close relationship. So I think now, yeah, it's an interesting case to see how the government will react, because they already given you the reason, right? So they're now being sued. So I'm really curious. In the newspapers, we don't hear a lot about that.
As I said, we don't either hear something about it. I once asked the state secretary when we had a discussion, he said, I can't say anything about it. Even if I knew it, I wouldn't. Yeah. So it's as much secrecy for us as for anybody else.
There was some communication that from the government last week that they stopped the negotiations because it's an interim government, but also I think there was a lot of frustration from government side sippling through the message about how Exxon is refusing to pay $500 million in compensation that they should be paying. So I think the irritation from the Dutch government is growing. But are there other questions? Yes, please.
It's possibly a question for Clémentine. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the International Court of Justice advisory opinion of the state's obligation on climate, and how we can use that possibly as an opportunity to fight against ISDS climate cases.
Yes, I can start. Yeah, thanks for the very interesting question. It's interesting that in the advisory opinion, there is also some specific provision on the problem of ISDS. So I think that could be in our case, which is more about EU law in itself, it's more about context. I would say it's not like a strong, it's interesting, but it is just indirectly has this could be used to maybe interpret EU law. Then it could be another cases, but which would be more before, for example, the European Court of Human Rights against one state for failing to exit its BITs. Then this kind of arguments could be used that by failing to exit, and actually 2 years ago, we had also initiated a case against the Energy Charter Treaty before the European Court of Human Rights, and we were representing 6 young victims of climate changes. And in that case, all the argument was that indirectly, the Energy Charter Treaty was, by producing a chilling effect, it contributed to preventing states from fighting climate change. So in this type of case, this would be directly relevant. We finally decided to discontinue the case as the new development as regards the Energy Charter Treaty were very positive, and most of the states exited the treaty. So that's why we discontinued the cases. But it could be really contemplated to launch another one against individual states for failing to exit their treaties, and that would be the type of legal argument that would be developed, and based on the advisory opinion would be really, really important in that type of case.
Yes, I have a question for Lynn. So thank you very much for also talking about the role of the last European Parliament. And I absolutely agree with you that that role was really decisive, and also in bringing down the Energy Charter Treaty. I'm wondering, looking ahead to the next couple of years with this new parliament, what opportunities you see there. I mean, we heard a little bit from Anna what opportunities she sees in terms of the multilateral investment court, but I'm also wondering about other more topical debates which we could hook the issue of ISDS to, in your opinion. And then I'm also wondering whether you hear any big proponents of ISDS that are still around and still large, and whether there is a need to also challenge their arguments. So a little bit more like what the current power structure is around the system that is still protecting ISDS.
Thank you so much. Just to pick it up from the earlier speakers, Bart mentioned the whole issue that most of the BITs are several years old. And if we talk in terms of the East African community and most African countries, some BITs were signed in the mid-1990s, actually before some countries gained independence. So I'd like to find out from you how the EU left can hold EU institutions and member states accountable for maintaining unjust, outdated treaties with African countries. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose for the first question, I think as I opened the session was that the landscape at the moment politically is pretty grim when you look at the makeup of the European Parliament, and we heard from the other Green MEP about the environmental agenda is pretty much gone. I kind of met with environmental NGOs at the start of this mandate saying that if we could hold on to what we've won in the last 5 years, we'd be doing well. I've kind of said now we're rolling back, unfortunately, on a lot. So I think that's where we have to be thinking strategically, and that's the sanctions cases are really, really interesting, because we know that a lot of the most vocal proponents of sanctions and measures against Russia are likely also to be the ones who are not so vocal about environmental issues. So I think we need to use that, and we have to be nimble in the arguments that we have. And, you know, when we work collaboratively, that people can bring these examples and say, have you thought of this? Because depending on who you're talking to in the room, you have to be able to use different case studies to you know, pique their interest. So I think that's a really interesting direction that we can be looking at. Certainly, I haven't come across many openly ISDS proponents, but I would still share the concerns around ICS and within CETA. And as a member state that hasn't yet fully ratified CETA, we are fighting that battle at the moment at home to ensure that doesn't happen. But at the World Trade Organization Public Forum last week, I overheard MEPs saying that those countries who haven't ratified just need to get on with it and get on with the programme. So that's sort of the attitude towards respecting the democratic processes of member states. So I think we are in a difficult time, but we need to find just the messaging and the levers to pull. And I think the sanctions one is really, really interesting, but also then looking at taking cases against individual member states to uphold the EU law is also an interesting strategy. And I mean, I've argued for unilateral measures when it comes to Israel, and I think we need unilateral strategies when it comes to getting member states to pull out of these bits.
Any of them. Thank you.
Maybe to start, and yeah, it's when we developed the legal strategy, actually we focus on what we have more possibility to win. So in that case, on illegality under EU law, it's true that it's a bit strange. It could be strange because we focus on more the interference with EU law and the fact that these old treaties I finally tie member states and prevent them for applying EU laws and sanctions. And we don't focus on the other side, which is really important, more important historically, because historically there are European investors using this treaty on a very unfair way against other countries in Africa, South America, etc. But it's true that from a pure legal strategy view on that case, it's not something that we can really take on board, because just on the legality. Then, if it was to be a human rights cases before another jurisdiction, then that would be really relevant. That because there is a principle of cooperation under international public law that could be used to at least argue that this treaties just breach the principles by allowing investors to use unfairly these old, totally incompatible with new treaties on human rights, on climate treaties against states. That could be this kind of argument. But maybe someone else has something to add.
Just to quickly respond to her, sorry? Yeah, to quickly respond to Herbert's question, which is an excellent question. Because in 2012, the European Commission basically grandfathered all of the existing member states' BITs that were, some of them were signed even in the 1960s or 1970s. So you're absolutely right about that. And that has been a fierce political battle. But one of the conditions for the grandfathering of these treaties is that they had to be in line with EU law. And, there is already a big question whether these treaties are in line with EU law. And, there have in fact been a couple of court cases lodged by the European Commission against 3 EU member states for not having their BITs in line with EU law on the basis of the capital transfer provisions. The European Commission never took on other EU member states, but you could, there is a broader implication of these 3 court cases for all the EU member states BIT, basically. So this is also a very relevant policy and even maybe a legal question, whether it was lawful that the European Commission grandfathered all of these treaties, if there is a question whether they are in line with EU law or not. So I think it's a very good question.
Okay, having said that, we came to the end of our time. I hope that this was an inspirational debate, which gives you new hooks or new ways of campaigning. We would like to invite all of you, if you're interested in this ISDS campaign, get in contact with the organizers. There's lots of people who are involved in the campaign already who are in the room. And I would like to thank again Lynn for hosting us, and also Cecilia for helping us very much with the organization, and Sharon as well. And of course, all the speakers who helped us to shape this campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.